That's enough. You're basically a stranger to us. Let's just throw you out into the yard.
Please wait. I was grabbed by my arm and thrown out into the yard. As the window sash closed sharply in front of me, I felt the blood drain from my face in despair. Why? This isn't right. Could Ken and Jessica, my in-laws, really be serious about making me live out here in the yard? The door was locked from the inside, and I was at a loss. I thought about going back to my parents' house, but it was too far, and I didn't think I had enough money for the fare. As my mind went blank, the door suddenly opened. I hoped they had reconsidered, but the voice that came back was still as cold as ice.
Here, eat this.
Jessica handed me a box of cup of noodles that had been stored for emergencies. Seeing it placed on the ground in a cardboard box, I was convinced that they were serious. You've got to be kidding. Wait, please. My desperate pleas were futile, and the door was mercilessly closed in front of me. If something happens to me, they'll be the ones in trouble. Maybe if I throw this out, they'll feel compelled to give me real food. In a fit of rage, I thought about throwing away everything inside. I opened the cardboard box somewhat roughly and found it packed tightly with cup noodles. What the? One of them was half open. I hesitantly reached out and picked up the cup of noodles. Wait, this is. My name is Linda Taylor. I'm a homemaker in my 40s. For the past several decades, since I married my husband, there has been something that has always troubled me. That is, hey, Ken, I always tell you to pick up your clothes. The living room was a mess with clothes that my husband, Ken, had taken off just after coming home from work. Ken has a habit of changing his clothes as soon as he gets home from work and just leaving them on the floor. Even now, he was naked on the sofa, scrolling through his phone. And he was laughing out loud while streaming videos at high volume. Perhaps because I interrupted his relaxation time, Ken spoke in a tone that clearly showed he was annoyed.
It's not a big deal. It's not bothering anyone.
It bothers me.
Huh? Why are you getting upset over something like this? No one likes a hysterical old lady these days. What are you going to do if you get even more wrinkles on your face?
His unwarranted verbal abuse made me frown. Yes, I had grown completely weary of his condescending tone and attitude. But the problem wasn't just that. It's really a small thing. Just put your clothes in the laundry basket.
Ugh, this is why I hate how nagging women can be. You're dependent on my earnings, yet do you realize you couldn't live properly without me?
As Ken continued to complain, he suddenly raised his voice and called out to someone.
Dad, Linda's telling me to pick up my clothes myself.
Wait a minute. Since it's a detached house, it probably won't bother the neighbors like in an apartment, but the loud voice still echoed. Proving this, heavy footsteps approached from the hallway, and the living room door was swung open somewhat violently. It was my father-in-law, Ronald. Ronald growled in a low voice from his throat and glared at me with a sharp gaze.
That's supposed to be your job.
Then, like the sound of an explosion, his voice hit my eardrums. All I could do was shrink a little under his intimidating presence.
Listen up. You married into this family, so you just need to obey your husband. That's how it is for women. Don't bother me or Ken with such trivial matters.
I'm sorry. At this point, all I could do was bow my head and apologize. Ken looked on, grinning at me. Ken's dad, Ronald, is a very traditional, old-school man. Whenever I try to talk about household chores or Ken's behavior, he would snap, "You don't need to think about that." It wasn't rare for him to raise his hand, and I had reflexively learned to make myself smaller. Ken had already shifted his interest back to a video on his smartphone, not looking at me. I felt gloomy, thinking I had to wait quietly until Ronald's anger subsided, when I was suddenly called upon by another person.
Hey, Linda, didn't I tell you not to use ham in the cooking?
It was Jessica, my mother-in-law, speaking from the kitchen where I had just finished preparing dinner.
It contains sodium metabisulfite, you know? It's not good for your health. And get rid of that strange device Ken brought home quickly. It emits electromagnetic waves that shrink our brain. A famous author said so.
Jessica wasn't like Ken, who twisted logic, nor was she like Ronald, who yelled. However, she was certainly not on my side. Even now, she sighed while holding special aluminum foil that supposedly blocks electromagnetic waves reaching the brain. Jessica had fallen for what they call conspiracy theories. I'm sorry, Jessica, but we need to get our protein.
There you go again. Where is the fish from? Did you check the source? And the additives too.
Jessica was overly sensitive to the effects of electromagnetic waves and harmful food additives. Because of this, cooking took much more effort than usual. Jessica would check every ingredient on food labels and restrict their use in cooking. Thus, the meals at the Taylor house could hardly be considered healthy. As I felt hopeless about the wasted ingredients, Jessica seemed to remember something.
By the way, you said before, didn't you, Linda? Ken is always eating out. You must be jealous, right?
It seemed that Ken had overheard her words.
Huh? Jealous?
Ken, who had been engrossed in his video, turned around irritably.
I'm going out for work, you know? It's not like I just have to do household chores like you.
That's not what I meant.
You're living off my earnings, and yet you dare to act so high and mighty?
While saying this, Ken glanced at Ronald, who looked displeased. Realizing what he was trying to do, all I could do was desperately apologize. I'm sorry. As a homemaker, it's true that I rely on Ken for our daily living. My finances are controlled by the allowance Ken gives me, and he quickly cuts the amount if he dislikes something. Satisfied with my trembling, apologetic demeanor, Ken said, "You can't do anything without me," and threw something at me.
As a punishment, you're having this for dinner tonight.
What rolled to my feet with a light sound was a cup of noodles. This is just. I'm the one who prepares the meals every day at the Taylor house. Housework is by no means easy, but I couldn't talk back, only remaining silent. In this house, I have no freedom. Why do I have to go through this? Unable to bear staying in the living room, I took the cup of noodles and went back to my room. From the living room, the loud sounds of the TV and Ken complaining about work could be heard. I boiled water in the pot, but I felt too disheartened to eat. Why can they say such hurtful things? Remembering their unreasonable demands made me feel down. I had merely asked him to correct a habit, not something unreasonable. The more I thought about it, the darker my mood became, and I wondered where I had made the wrong choice, feeling increasingly depressed. I couldn't move for a while, weighed down by a heavy heart. As bedtime approached and my hunger reached its limit, I reluctantly ate some instant noodles and took a cold bath. I had to get out quickly before I got too cold, because if I caught a cold, I would have to ask Ken for money and permission to go to the doctor. Once everyone was asleep, I tiptoed back to my room without making a sound and secretly took out my diary from the drawer. This diary is a record of daily events, intended to one day expose the way I've been treated. When Ken and I first started dating, he wasn't like this. He used to cherish our anniversaries and birthdays, and I never saw him use a rough tone. I married him believing he was a kind person, but the reality was completely different. In this house, I somehow feel treated like something tainted. Much of this can be attributed to Jessica's inclination towards conspiracy theories. Being unfamiliar with such theories, I have been shunned for supposedly leading a lifestyle that Jessica despises, fearing it might negatively affect her son. I am forced to prepare separate meals, and I've never been included in their circle of 3. However, I managed to find some solace in secretly eating what I like and writing in this diary. I hope I can expose this one day. I've thought about asking for help more than once, but the fear of causing harm to my parents back home prevents me from taking any action. Escaping is difficult without sufficient funds, and who would hire a woman in her 40s who has been a homemaker all this time? At times like this, Ken's words, "You can't live without me," really hit home, and I felt so powerless that I was on the verge of tears. In the end, unable to find a solution, I could only curl up and sleep in my bed. The next day was eventful. The area outside my room was unusually noisy, and just as I wondered what had happened, Ronald hurriedly opened my door.
Hey, call an ambulance right now, Ken.
Apparently, Ken, who usually wakes up late, wasn't breathing when Ronald went to wake him up. I frantically called an ambulance. Even though he had oppressed me for years, I couldn't just ignore someone in life-threatening danger. While on the phone, I tried to perform CPR in desperation, but Ken was gone. How could this be? He seemed fine just the day before, so why did his health suddenly decline? Overwhelmed by the sudden event, I was devastated and couldn't even begin to prepare for the funeral after returning from the hospital. The Taylor house was filled with a somber atmosphere, unlike usual.
Come to think of it, he did seem unwell recently.
Is that so? Ronald murmured. Understandably, he had no energy left to yell at me now that his son had passed. I had no idea that Ken had been feeling unwell. Our only time together was during meals in separate rooms, and he was at work while I did housework during the day, so we barely saw each other. Yet, I couldn't help but think if I had noticed something amiss. Regardless of the deep rift between us, the fact that my husband was gone remained. Forgetting my usual demeanor, I leaned forward impulsively. Then why didn't he go to the hospital? If he was that ill, there must have been some signs, right?
I told him not to go, and to stop taking over-the-counter meds too. After all, you never know what you might be ingesting.
Jessica said in a matter-of-fact tone. It seemed that despite knowing about Ken's ill health, her belief in conspiracy theories was too strong to abandon. Struck by such a ridiculous reason, I was overwhelmed by an immense sense of helplessness. Dumbfounded, I didn't know what to say, whether to Ken, who believed Jessica's words, or to Jessica herself, who never doubted her baseless conspiracies. Is that so? People tend to laugh when faced with overwhelmingly hopeless situations. I couldn't help but shiver slightly. However, that was probably not the best reaction.
What's that reaction for?
A voice so low it seemed to resonate from the depths shook my eardrums. I startled and looked up. Oh, this isn't.
What do you mean it's not? You just laughed, didn't you? Are you the kind of person who laughs at her husband's misfortune?
I'm sorry. I didn't mean it like that. I was just thinking about Ken. I had completely done the unnecessary. Perhaps my emotions weren't functioning properly in the face of sudden misfortune. But it was too late to take it back, and Jessica's cold voice pierced through me.
No excuses. You laughed. That's a fact. Don't tell me you poisoned him.
No, I didn't do anything like that. I shook my head frantically, on the verge of tears. Indeed, there was every reason to suspect me since I had been treated harshly by Ken. Although most of the meals were dictated by Jessica, I was the one who prepared their food.
That's enough. Without Ken, you're nothing more than a stranger. Let's just throw you out in the yard.
Exactly. Don't think you can ever come back inside.
Please wait. Ronald grabbed my arm, and I was literally thrown out into the yard. The window sash snapped shut in front of me, and I felt the color drain from my face in despair. Why? This isn't right. Living in the yard was no joke. The door was locked from the inside, and I panicked, wondering if they were serious. How could I expose them if I couldn't even retrieve my diary? I thought about going back to my parents' house, but it was a considerable distance from here. I doubted I had enough money for transportation. As my mind went blank, wondering what to do, the door suddenly opened. Jessica? Throwing me out into the yard wouldn't look good to the neighbors either. Hoping she had reconsidered, I asked expectantly, but the voice that returned was still as cold as ice.
Don't call me so casually. After all, it would be troublesome for us if something happened. Here, eat this. It's full of additives, though.
And what was handed to me was a box of instant noodles that had been stored for emergencies. Seeing it placed on the ground in a cardboard box, I was convinced that they were serious. You must be kidding. Please wait. After all, there was no way to boil water or a kitchen in the yard, so eating properly was out of the question. But my desperate pleas were in vain, and the door was mercilessly closed in front of me. I stood there dumbfounded for a moment. But as time passed, I began to feel anger boiling up from within. I can't stand this anymore. What had I done to deserve this? It was true that laughing was my mistake, but they won't listen to a word I say. They don't even try to hear me out. They have never been. There was no freedom for me here. Anything they didn't want was simply eliminated. Talking was useless with someone who had no intention of listening. If something happens to me, they'll be in trouble. Maybe if I throw this out, they might be inclined to give me proper food. In frustration, I thought about throwing out all the contents of the instant noodles. It seemed wasteful, but continuing to live on instant noodles was out of the question. As I opened the cardboard box somewhat roughly, I found the packed noodles. Wait, this one's open. There was just one, the lid halfway open. I clenched my fist, a bad feeling gripping me. Could this also be one of their ways to harass me? Tentatively, I reached out and picked up the cup of noodles. As I fully opened the half-open lid, instead of the dried noodles and toppings, there was a small black device and a piece of notepaper inside. What is this? I unfolded the notepaper. The letter said, "I'm truly sorry for the long hardship. Unclosed is a voice recorder. Please take this evidence to the police. Also, the envelope contains some money for you. Use it to live freely. This is." The note was on elegant wisteria stationery, with neat handwriting done with a pen. I had seen it only a few times, but it was unmistakably Jessica's handwriting. Inside the envelope were 5 $100 bills, and similarly, envelopes, each containing $500, were stuffed into the small gaps of the cup noodles packed in the cardboard box. Additionally, some contained accusations detailing the domestic behaviors of Ronald and Ken. Before I knew it, I felt as if I had been pushed from behind, and I found myself running to the nearby police station. "Please help me." Breathing heavily and barefoot, the officers immediately responded to my appearance. As they read the accusation and listened to my story, their expressions darkened rapidly. I explained how I had been thrown out into the yard and was unable to enter the house or go back to my parents' home. Considering these factors, they judged it to be an urgent issue. The officer, with a serious look, patted my shoulder reassuringly.
"This is terrible. Linda, you've done well. Can you lead us to your house?"
Yes. A turning point had finally come in my days of near despair. The days of being oppressed by the Taylor family might just change. Filled with a faint hope, I returned home when suddenly a furious shout echoed from the entrance.
What are you doing?
It was Ronald's enraged voice. Then, a sharp sound like something being hit followed, and we hurriedly opened the front door. What happened? There, panting heavily, was Ronald, and Jessica, sitting on the floor clutching her reddened cheek. Ronald, blinded by anger, hadn't even noticed the arrival of the police. It was clear what had happened. Jessica. As I ran towards her with a scream-like shout, Jessica finally looked up. And the moment her vacant eyes caught me and the officer, she burst out laughing as if she couldn't hold it back any longer.
Ha, ha.
What happened, Jessica?
Laughing at a time like this. Ken's gone, and now talking about divorce. Don't joke around.
Amid the strange behavior of both, a crumpled divorce paper lay on the floor. Could it be that Jessica had confronted him with it? She had always been submissive to Ronald, never seeming to defy him. Laughing hysterically as if she had gone mad, Ronald raised his hand to strike.
"Stop."
but a quick-moving officer restrained him by locking his arms. Only then did Ronald seem to realize that the police were present. As his complexion turned pale, Jessica started laughing again.
Ha ha.
What really happened, Jessica? Her increasingly unusual demeanor left us all frozen, unable to move. I tentatively called out, trying to gauge the situation. Jessica, flushed with excitement and still smiling, blurted out,
Finally, it's over for you.
What do you mean?
Ronald, receiving an empty stare, squeezed out a voice as if shaken. Not giving Ronald a moment to compose himself, Jessica continued.
Right now, you can't move, can you? You want to hit me, but you can't, right? Do you know why? Because that officer over there has more power than you. Linda and I have felt the same way you feel now for a long time.
What?
I've been waiting for this day to come for so long.
I was too shocked to form coherent words. The statement Jessica had just made was clearly considerate of me. Jessica suddenly stopped laughing, and her face went blank.
You always do this. If something displeases you, you raise your hand immediately, and you're not satisfied unless others behave exactly as you want. Dialogue is out of the question. You think it's only natural for those weaker than you to follow your commands, and for you to be supported by others. You've been abusive towards me ever since Ken was born. You knew I couldn't escape because I was a homemaker who had become estranged from her parents. That's why I've been planning this day for a long time.
Jessica, her voice icy, stared Ronald down as she began to explain her long-standing plan.
Initially, the evidence was insufficient, and there was Ken to consider, so I planned to carry it out when Ken was independent and had saved enough money. I never imagined he would marry Linda so quickly and then start doing the same things you did. Ken was more cowardly than you, but also more cunning. I pretended to be a crazy conspiracy theorist, feeding you unhealthy meals on purpose.
Hearing this, I realized something. Indeed, as a homemaker tasked with caring for Ronald and Jessica, I was responsible for preparing meals for the three of us. I followed Jessica's preferences for avoiding additives and foreign products, resulting in meals that were hardly what one would consider healthy. But Jessica, who disliked me, always said, "I don't want to eat the same food as you," and made me cook different meals for myself. So, I cooked as I pleased and ate what I liked. If what she said was true, was it all an act? And if so, had Jessica intentionally excluded me from her plans all along?
It was a long battle, but then Ken turned out exactly as I had planned. Surely his daily overwork and poor diet took their toll.
Jessica paused, perhaps thinking of her son, her voice dropping for a moment. However, she quickly began to laugh as if ignited.
But now Ken's inheritance can be given to Linda. You and I are going to hell together. Ha ha.
Ronald seemed unable to say anything more. He stared wide-eyed at Jessica, who was laughing like a mad woman.
You always acted like a king at home, but do you see now? You were so powerless.
It wasn't just me who had suffered. Jessica had suffered and endured far longer than I had, and today she had reached the culmination of her struggles. Indeed, she had been fighting throughout her life, even though it twisted her existence.
We'll be going now. You both will accompany us to the station. We'll discuss everything there.
The officer said quietly. Ronald no longer raised his voice in anger. It was as if all the energy that had driven him until now was gone, and he hung his head in defeat. As he was led away by the police officer, he said in a barely audible voice.
I'm sorry.
However, Jessica responded with a voice that sounded like a mix of laughing and crying.
Apologizing now, what good does it do?
And so, we walked quietly to the police station, none of us uttering a single word. Ronald readily admitted to everything documented in the accusation and recorded on the voice recorder regarding the situation inside the Taylor household. As a result, it was determined that Ken's sudden health change was not accidental but planned, indicating criminal activity. Of course, Jessica was identified as the perpetrator. After all was said and done, Jessica, who had seemed spiteful and had laughed maniacally, became meek, as if all her previous behavior had been a facade.
Linda, I'm truly sorry for involving you in my plan.
No, please don't apologize. You've been suffering for so long, Jessica.
No, even so, it doesn't change the fact that I've hurt you repeatedly.
I remembered the neat handwriting on the letter that was inside the cup of noodles. Now it seemed that the considerately written words truly reflected her genuine character.
It must have been very sad to have the meals you prepared thrown away for no good reason.
No. I shook my head. While it was true that it was hard at the time, and I had many tearful nights, it now seemed like a trivial thing. It wasn't about forgiving or not forgiving. I just thought that we deserved to be released from it. It's okay now. It's all over. Then, 10 years passed. Today is Jessica's birthday. Since then, having gathered the courage to start working, I was fortunate to find a warm workplace and am leading an independent life. And today, I had quietly saved up some of my salary to take Jessica on a little trip. Look, Jessica, the wisteria flowers are beautiful. After the events at the Taylor household settled down, Jessica had fallen ill. Pushing her wheelchair, which had become essential for her mobility, we walked under an arch bursting with magnificent wisteria blossoms.
Yes, they're beautiful.
Jessica seemed to be enjoying this thoughtful trip. After all that had happened with the Taylor family, I had decided to support Jessica. Now, she is an important part of my family. We care for each other, share words, and sometimes enjoy moments of interaction like this. Jessica, I have a special birthday cake prepared. Let's eat it together when we get back to the hotel.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to it.
We chatted as we slowly walked under the wisteria flowers, visiting nearby boutiques and tourist shops. Jessica seemed to be enjoying the trip, so it was safe to say it was a great success. We have our freedom now, and we do what we want, following our hearts. While hoping days like these would continue, I began to hum, "Happy Birthday to You."
I got my mistress pregnant. I'm divorcing you, so don't bother coming home.
The letter enclosed with the divorce papers contained cruel words. I had hoped my husband, John, would be happy about the birth of our child, but instead, he was busy cheating with his mistress. He didn't even attend the birth or help name our child. I could no longer forgive John. While calming down my furious parents, I headed to my in-laws' house.
I'm truly sorry. We must have gone wrong somewhere in raising him.
Upon reading the letter, my in-laws, Ron and Linda, turned pale and apologized to us. They are such good people that it made me feel even more guilty. Ron sighed deeply and muttered to Linda,
Should we crush him?
My name is Emily. I'm 35. I met John in my early 20s at a movie theater. John had tripped on the carpet and spilled popcorn all over the floor. I hurried to help him, and John bought me a drink as an apology, and we became close. It just so happened that we were both there to see a limited run of a famous animated movie. The protagonist shared my name, Emily. John, a fan of the movie, was excited.
Your name is Emily. I love that movie. It doesn't feel like you're a stranger at all.
I love it too. Have you seen the latest animated movie? We shared the same interests and became movie buddies, and eventually, John and I started dating. Then, at a restaurant themed around movies, he proposed to me with a ring, and I decided to share my life with him. John had received a company from his father Ron, a businessman, and was thriving as a young president. So after getting married, I quit my previous job and joined the company as a director, getting involved in management. It was fulfilling work where I could use my business school experience. I had thought my in-laws would be intimidating celebrities, but they were not at all like that. They were friendly from the first meeting, and after getting married, they continued to care for us without being overbearing. They kept a respectful distance, but were not pushy.
Emily, I got some gourmet coupons. Let's go eat something delicious together. Oh, and feel free to say no if you're busy.
They would invite me out to eat and cook for me. I love cooking with my mill, Linda. She generously shared secret ingredients and tips for sauces, and I would try them out at home and serve them to John. Even when we disagreed, it was never serious, just playful arguments. Ron was so considerate, it was almost too much.
Would it be tacky to give Mama moisturizer for her birthday? I'm at the department store right now. I'll buy some moisturizer for you too, Emily.
He would say that, giving me cosmetics I had wanted for a long time, as if it were advice fees. Their loving relationship always made me smile. I hoped John and I could have a relationship like my in-laws. However, the peaceful life didn't last long. When my pregnancy became apparent, a new employee joined the company. Nancy, who was hired mid-career and seemed competent, was very beautiful. During the interview, she said something that caught attention.
I was harassed at my previous company.
It turns out, she had been harassed as a new graduate at her first job, and even at the next company she joined, which led her to resign. I was in charge of HR, but I had an appointment for a checkup, so John handled Nancy's interview. Despite it being odd to bring up past harassment at a new job, it was decided for us to be considerate to Nancy, who must have had a tough time before. Especially, John seemed to like her, giving her a supervisory role soon after she joined. Isn't it too soon to be in a higher position just after joining?
It'll be fine. She has more work experience than a fresh grad, after all.
I felt a bit uneasy about John's personal management. And indeed, it turned out Nancy was quite a character. First of all, she was very rude. To be precise, her tone was polite, but her words were harsh. For example, when dealing with mistakes made by new or young employees at work, it goes beyond merely pointing out the mistakes. The criticism is particularly harsh regarding their educational background.
Oh, is this the kind of mistake your alma mater trained you to make? Is your university a kindergarten? Oh, sorry, I guess it's just your brain that's lacking.
Although it's a common mistake that just needs more caution in the future, the way she belittles people is harsh.
Your parents must feel sorry for raising such an incompetent person.
Such comments, even going as far as to insult someone's parents, are unacceptable for a professional. Of course, I've pointed it out, but there's no sign of remorse. That's not a good way to speak. You shouldn't attack someone's character.
People who aren't beneficial to the company are just a waste, right? I'm just doing my job as a senior by pointing it out and giving guidance.
Just like that, she was completely unapologetic. Nancy, she really has a way with words. What should we do?
It's fine, isn't it? She's still adjusting, right? Picking on the newbies isn't cool.
Saying this, John didn't take my advice. Being pregnant, I couldn't get too involved in company matters, but the atmosphere around Nancy was deteriorating. Although Nancy boasted about being excellent, others didn't see her as all that competent. She might be good at studying and memorization, having knowledge about the job, but she often couldn't apply it practically. Perhaps due to a habit of negligence, she frequently relied on existing templates without necessary modifications. Because she wouldn't change what needed to be changed, she constantly received corrections. Seemingly displeased with this, she was full of excuses trying to justify herself.
I was just working efficiently. Maybe the way we do things around here is inefficient, don't you think?
I understand your point, but this format is what fits in with our company.
It's poor guidance from the supervisors. The mistakes I made were beyond my control, not my fault. Besides, since you're pregnant, shouldn't you just stay away from the company more?
No matter how many times she's corrected, we couldn't see any improvements from her. Nancy, having said something to John, caused him to even started blaming me.
Hey, Nancy's a pool thing. What if your words hurt her and she quits?
Moreover, Nancy often brags about buying expensive deli food from the department store.
Employee cafeterias are so tacky. It's just smarter and a better use of time to eat out and occasionally cook with high-end ingredients at home.
Saying this, she tries to one-up others. I make vegetable-centered lunches for John, but even that's ridiculed by her.
Home-cooked meals, more like brown mush. The presentation is awful, and it'd be 100 times better just to buy something. Poor president.
That's right. Nancy has a point. The president wouldn't eat something like this.
Saying this, John stopped taking the lunches I prepared. I don't like to make comparisons, but Ron, who sticks to the motto keep unnecessary expenses low, earns a lot yet enjoys his mother's homemade sandwiches. As a result, our expenses on eating out and buying ready-made meals keep adding up, increasingly straining our budget. Since Nancy joined, the relationship between me and John has been strained.
You've really packed on the pounds recently. What happened to how you looked before getting pregnant?
It's just my body type.
Ha, nice. Pregnant women get to be lazy, huh?
John makes a displeased face as I struggle with morning sickness and can't maintain my figure or beauty during pregnancy. His parents are always nice to me, so it was hard to speak up about their son, John. As morning sickness started, it became difficult to continue working, and I began to stay at home. Encouraged by my parents, I considered going back to my hometown for the birth, but John was reluctant.
Why would you do that? Who's going to take care of me while you're gone?
You'll have to manage on your own.
You just want to take it easy, don't you? No one I know does this. Going back home for birth isn't normal statistically speaking.
I wonder whose statistics those are. John apparently told Nancy about it too.
Going back home for the birth? Isn't that a bit too dependent? I can't respect a company president's wife like that.
And such an email arrived from Nancy. Why do I have to be subjected to this? My frustration grew day by day. Nancy's condescension wasn't just directed at subordinates, but also at older employees. One day, just before going back home for my maternity leave, I went shopping for maternity goods and miscellaneous items. There, I ran into an employee, Mary, who happened to be buying envelopes and stationery. She looked clearly distressed, and upon asking, I found out she was intending to write her resignation letter. Mary had been repeatedly harassed by Nancy. Mary, a top graduate from a high school with specialized knowledge and a bookkeeping certification, was a valuable asset immediately upon hiring. Ron had scouted her and always valued her greatly. In fact, Mary was the most active contributor in our company. Without her, the company would suffer a significant loss. She didn't desire a high-ranking position because she needed to care for her triplets. I don't know how Nancy found out or if she forced it out of her, but as soon as Nancy learned about Mary's high school education, she blatantly ridiculed her and started ignoring her greetings. Mary was in a managerial position in a different department, but if requests came through her, Nancy blatantly ignored them. Mary, angered, confronted Nancy directly. But Nancy mocked her by saying, "You're a high school graduate, T-Fect. Why should I prioritize the work of someone so lowly? Your kids are a poor thing to be raised by someone like you." She said something outrageous. Mary was naturally furious and pressed Nancy about it.
My education has nothing to do with this. Why do you have to bring up my children?
I think Mary was rightfully angry. But apparently dissatisfied with this, Nancy made a big fuss to John.
I was publicly denounced and harassed in front of everyone. I suffered mental distress.
Normally, Nancy would be the one reprimanded, but astonishingly, John completely sided with her.
What is this? A veteran pressing a newcomer? Just because you've been here a long time doesn't mean you can get carried away.
Eventually, it was settled with Mary apologizing to Nancy. A little investigation would clearly show that Nancy was the problem. Of course, Nancy was smug about it.
Well, I'm generous enough to forgive someone like you. From now on, know your place.
She didn't think she was at fault at all.
She apologized. I'm in the right.
And with that, she just became more arrogant. As a favorite of the president, even veterans became her targets, and it seemed no one could say anything anymore. Nancy's unruly behavior only got worse. She sent rude emails to business partners, so it became absolutely necessary to double-check her communications. Her emails were long-winded rants or informal to the point of calling important people from other companies by their first names, issues that predate professional etiquette.
Well, if Nancy is as pretty as she is, a few mistakes can be forgiven, right?
John, you're so kind.
John kept making such clueless remarks. The business partner was a fairly large one, so later I was told to go and apologize along with the executive director, but Nancy refused to accompany us.
Why do I have to go apologize? There's no need to be so humble.
That was the tone all along. So a few months after Nancy joined, she was completely treated like a hot potato. People would greet her and interact with her for work, but otherwise, she was totally untouchable. No matter how often it was pointed out, she would not adhere to the company's specified dimensions, and she maintained her usual attitude even when corrected.
It's unpleasant to be criticized by low-educated people like you, so don't point it out.
So now, it seems easier to just correct everything at the final stage without saying anything. I had no idea it had come to this.
Emily, you're pregnant, and it must be hard, so I understand you can't say much. It's okay about me, but when she talks about my kids.
Mary seemed even more distressed as she recalled Nancy's words.
I'm sorry for doing this on my own, but once my child secures a job, I won't have to work so frantically anymore. Maybe retiring is one option here.
Saying that, Mary smiled at me, obviously concerned for my well-being.
The resignation letter is just a precaution. I still have responsibilities, and quitting abruptly would be rude. I'll try to hang in there for a few more months. Have a healthy baby, okay?
Filled with regret, all I could do was watch Mary walk away. After returning home, I confronted John, but it was to no avail.
You're not at the office right now, so you don't understand the situation. You shouldn't even be speaking up.
But it's too much even for Mary. We should value our employees, shouldn't we?
That's why I am valuing Nancy. Honestly, Mary is already old, and she won't contribute much to the company moving forward. Maybe it's time to consider a change.
John left the house clearly in a bad mood. Lately, he's been staying out more, and something felt off. He wasn't helping at all with naming our child, and it seemed like his heart was drifting further from me. In my final month of pregnancy, I noticed that my toenail had split. I couldn't reach my feet anymore because my belly was in the way, and I asked John, who was in the living room. My toenail split, but I can't cut it myself. Could you help me trim it a little? John's response was a complete turnaround.
You want me to do menial tasks like that?
He slammed the newspaper on the floor, swept all the items off the table, and stormed out, stomping loudly. I wonder if he realizes whose child I'm carrying. After all, I've even cut his nails before. Realizing this was not good for the baby, I decided to go to my parents' home early. When I told John, his response was dismissive.
Fine, just leave already.
I assume it goes without saying, but please come to the hospital when the baby is born, okay?
I'm busy, you know.
Doesn't he care that our child is being born? Isn't he looking forward to it? Even though John had been so against for me to go to my parents' home for the birth, he agreed so easily now, which felt strange, but people change. Men often realize they are becoming fathers later on, I told myself. After John left for work, my father, who was looking forward to the arrival of his grandchild, came to pick me up. At my parents' house, I could relax and spend time with them. My in-laws also kept in touch, maintaining a respectful distance. However, I hardly had any contact with John. A month later, I gave birth at a major hospital. This is our first child, right? I want you to be there, If not inside, then at least wait outside the delivery room.
I'm busy with work. Do you think I can just run over because my child is being born?
My parents and in-laws were furious and tried calling him multiple times. However, John must have blocked my calls because he never showed up for the birth of our child. Our baby was a girl, truly adorable and angelic. But since we hadn't really discussed names, I ended up choosing Sophia for her. While I was recovering at my parents' house, taking care of Sophia, an envelope arrived from John by mail. Inside was a divorce petition, and a letter was enclosed.
I got my mistress pregnant, so don't come back home.
There was also a photo of him making a peace sign with a woman inside our house. The woman was Nancy. My parents were livid, their faces turning red with anger. Despite the clear betrayal by John, I felt strangely calm. I wonder if his parents know about this. My parents and I immediately went to see my in-laws.
Oh dear, did you come to show us little Sophia?
My in-laws welcomed us warmly, but I had to tell them. While my mother took care of Sophia in another room, I showed the divorce papers and the letter to my in-laws. Linda was speechless, and Ron turned pale.
I thought something was off with him lately, but I never imagined it had come to this.
We've been feeling like he was being bothersome to us too. I'm really sorry, Emily. We must have gone wrong somewhere in raising him.
Watching my in-laws apologizing deeply was truly heart-wrenching. Please stop. I didn't come here for you to apologize to me like this. I hurriedly made Ron and Linda lift their faces. Ron sighed deeply and muttered to Linda.
Should we crush him?
After reuniting with my in-laws, we decided to return to the house where John was. Ron and Linda rang the doorbell with a furious expression, and John came out in a panic.
What's going on? All of a sudden.
What kind of person are you? Don't you feel sorry for what you've done to Emily?
Overlapping John's words, Ron confronted him. John scratched his head with an annoyed expression and clicked his tongue.
PCH. Don't rat me out.
He glared at me. Then, Nancy casually appeared behind him.
John, who's that?
As soon as she saw me, she almost burst out laughing.
What? The loser wife? Huh? Did you sign the divorce papers?
Why are you even here?
You can see, right? John and I are starting a new life of love here. You've been dumped, so pack your things and leave.
How audacious can they get? Fueled by their unrepentant attitude, my in-laws stormed through the entrance and headed straight to the living room. When I saw the living room, I was speechless. It had been completely redecorated to their taste. Maternity items with Nancy's name were everywhere, and their pictures were displayed on the shelves. It seemed they had completely taken over while I was away for my childbirth. The discussion began, but the two were utterly defiant.
John, Emily was trying her best to give birth to your child. It was strange you didn't even come to see the baby. And now this.
You lied to us. You prioritized your affair over important business meetings.
Confronted by someone superior, John sulked.
Well, she got fat from the pregnancy and expected me to suddenly start acting like a dad, which is presumptuous. Nancy, who respects me, is obviously the better choice, right? I even started to find the child unattractive midway.
Being a father is the most basic responsibility.
Ron yelled so loudly that John jumped, and Linda slapped him while crying.
Pathetic. You're also to blame. You don't even look at Sophia even though she's your child.
Indeed, as Linda said, John had barely glanced at Sophia, let alone held her. He probably thinks Nancy's child is cuter.
That's so annoying. She kept updating me about this ugly baby's growth, but frankly, I couldn't care less. I don't want to hear about it after coming home from work. Be grateful I didn't say just raise her by yourself.
Exactly. John was struggling. Hearing about an unattractive baby getting bigger in an ultrasound or gaining a few grams is just not interesting.
It was maddening. Poor Sophia, disliked by her own father from birth.
What kind of person are you? When you see your wife immobile from her pregnancy, or your child who looks like she could break any moment, you should feel a sense of urgency to protect them before anything else.
That's right. I will not acknowledge a child from an affair you had while knowing you were married. We only care about Emily and Sophia.
The two seemed as if my in-laws' words didn't reach them. No matter what else was said, it wouldn't resonate with them. If that was the case, it would be much better to just get a divorce quickly. While consulting with my in-laws, I had John sign the alimony demand letter we drafted together. Then, we filed the divorce papers at the courthouse. Now that the divorce is finalized, why don't you just get married?
Well, despite being old, you're pretty sharp.
How miserable to be thrown out with just a few $100,000 in alimony.
They stamped the documents vigorously, showing off to me. When they asked me to be a witness, I was beyond sadness and humiliation. I was utterly appalled. When we got home, my in-laws declared they were cutting ties with them. Upon hearing this, their faces turned pale. Did they really think they would still be accepted after all this?
You're disowning your own son.
We're blood related too. We'll become better children, we promise.
Nancy glared at me. Her pride was high, probably soaking in a sense of superiority for having taken John from me. However, my in-laws cherished me, which she couldn't stand. But the consequences for John and her wouldn't end there.
Also, you're stepping down as president.
What?
Of course, you're not fit to be president, favoring your affair partner and causing suffering to other employees. Everyone knows.
John was at a loss for words. Had he been aware?
But I am the president.
Yeah, right? Just because you're the parents doesn't mean you can just fire him.
That's true. If you don't want to retire willingly, it's not going to be immediate.
Ron's words made them lift their chins triumphantly.
But can you two really continue to run the company?
What do you mean?
I secretly surveyed your employees. They said if you remain as president, they would leave the company. It was originally one of my companies, so they all cooperated.
John and Nancy were speechless. If they all quit simultaneously, the company would immediately become inoperable.
Stop threatening me, Dad. Those guys, they can't find another job.
I've promised to hire them in a new department I'm establishing in my company. Seems they really hated the current one. Everyone was quite pleased.
What? Those traitors?
They shrieked, their faces turning a fiery red. However, with Ron's careful planning, they were left with no choice, and John agreed to step down as president.
But you'll at least keep us as executives, right? We can't live otherwise. Don't demote us to ordinary employees. Right, Nancy? Nancy can become the next president.
Sorry, but the next president has already been decided.
Ron spoke confidently, leaving John flustered.
Who is it?
It's Mary. She's the most experienced, and Emily will support her in the presidency. You don't have to worry about anything. You're not just demoted, you're fired.
Hearing that Mary was the successor, Nancy's mouth fell open, and soon she began to throw a tantrum.
Why her? How can someone with just a high school diploma become president?
Don't be rude. Mary has been cleaning up your mess at work. Oh, and unfortunately, due to compliance issues and numerous complaints about you, we can't employ you anymore.
No.
Nancy started tearing at her hair.
It's all because everyone speaks ill of me. They're jealous of my superior education. You believe those who fabricate such baseless bad reputations?
Was this a state of delirium? Nancy continued to shriek disgracefully. In fact, after parting with Mary, I immediately reported the situation at the company to my in-laws. Ron had been keeping out of company affairs, thinking it wouldn't help John. Upon learning about Mary's situation, Nancy's tyranny, and John's negligence, Ron immediately contacted Mary. He apologized for John's and Nancy's rudeness and approached her about becoming the next president. Mary, surprised, agreed to take over the role.
And one more thing. Are you really the graduate your resume claims?
Nancy had been hired essentially on the spot due to John's infatuation, labeled as an interview. This meant no background check had been conducted on Nancy. If her claims were to be believed, Nancy boasted of graduating from a prestigious university with honors. Her parents and relatives also had impressive backgrounds and were quite wealthy. Nancy often bragged about this, yet oddly, she never seemed grateful to her parents. With a salary that didn't match her age or position, she owned several expensive watches and frequently updated her expensive electronics, living alone in a luxurious high-end apartment. Socially, she appeared to be a winner leading a lavish lifestyle. It was questionable why someone like her would want to work for us.
I get bored staying at home.
That's her only excuse. I've seen wealthy people who are friendly with my in-laws. They all seem so calm. It made me believe the saying, "Wealth does not fight," was indeed true. Despite supposedly being part of the elite group, Nancy's aggressiveness and tendency to blame others, coupled with a strong victim mentality, could only be described as poor upbringing.
I'm sorry to say this, but I had it checked. You were indeed at that university, but it turns out you dropped out. And the reason was due to plagiarism in reports and your thesis. Other misconducts were repeated, too. It didn't take long to find out.
Nancy bit her lip and looked down. John stood up and started accusing Nancy.
So, you lied to me. Is that why you never invited me to your house?
What? I approached you because you were the president. Why has it come to this?
It seems Nancy's parents are somewhat wealthy. However, due to her academic fraud and dropping out, they wanted her to face the real world, thus pushed her to get a job. But even there, her tyrannical behavior got her fired, and after causing significant losses to the company, they gave her severance money and kicked her out. The amount was enough for a while to maintain her lavish lifestyle, but it was inevitable that Nancy couldn't cut back on her expenses. Eventually, her savings ran dry, and she even started accumulating debt. That's when she seduced John, a young president, planning to secure a spot as his wife by getting pregnant. Her behavior in the company was due to the belief that eventually everyone would be under her, using her unfinished university degree to look down on others. Losing the presidency to Mary was an immense humiliation for her. The harassment at her previous job was a preemptive strike and an interview strategy to garner sympathy. I realized as I looked at her like she was an alien.
So I lost the company because of you. That child of yours must be a lie too.
No, this is really your child.
Despite becoming parents, the two started an ugly fight. When I was feeling sick from my pregnancy, John was having an affair with Nancy and mocking me. Their downfall was their own doing. My in-laws kicked John and Nancy out and told me to stay in the house, but I refused. After battling morning sickness and preparing a space for the baby goods, I couldn't stand returning to a home filled with John and Nancy's wedding photos and paraphernalia. I wanted to get away from a home that had been redecorated to flaunt their happiness. John and Nancy left the current company. Apparently, their married life wasn't going well. John had been expecting financial support from Ron and had little savings.
How can you just abandon me like that? Do Mom and Dad hate me now too?
You abandoned Emily and Sophia. If you want help, apologize to Emily first.
Why should I apologize to her? I absolutely won't.
John was stubbornly unwilling to apologize. Using his friend's connections, he started working at another company. But fitting in wasn't easy for someone who had been at the top. For example, John left a meeting with a partner company midway through and never returned, instead going straight back to his office.
He was so boring that I didn't think it was worth my time. I know these things because I was the president before.
He laughed it off even when scolded for such behavior. But there were worse blunders. He received a delivery from a client, but forgot to send the invoice to accounting.
I should have received the invoice in time for this month's payment deadline, right?
Pushed by the client, he finally checked and discovered the paperwork was amiss. His response was inapologetic.
I totally forgot to pass it on to accounting. The payment will be next month.
That's a problem. I sent it over a month and a half ago. This is your mistake, isn't it? Please deal with this urgently.
So, what? I just sent it to accounting, and normally it would be the month after next, but I asked them to make an exception and do it next month. Aren't you being a bit pushy now?
Incredibly, John snapped at the client who was making a perfectly reasonable request. His tone was full of self-victimization and frustration. The client was furious.
Blaming others for your mistakes. How appropriate is that? I can't discuss this with you. Let me talk to your boss.
What? Why do you need to involve my boss when it's my job?
Hey, do you even realize the inconvenience you're causing? You're being told to step aside because you lack any sense of responsibility. Get it together.
Scolded, John quickly grew tired of his job. His actions even angered a usually mild-mannered client to an extreme degree, causing problems within the company.
I can't believe you're looking down on me.
Instead of showing any remorse in a situation that would normally cause one to blanch, John stubbornly refused to apologize and ended up getting fired. Naturally, this cut off his source of income, and with constant conflicts with Nancy, he bounced from job to job. He frequently asked his parents for financial help, but they consistently refused. A year later, I was raising Sophia under the watchful eyes of my parents and in-laws. One day, while holding Sophia outside my parents' house, I noticed a man standing there. While I was soothing Sophia, I thought he seemed intensely focused on us.
Ugh.
Suddenly, he started to sob, covering his mouth. "What's the matter?" The man suddenly approached, trying to touch Sophia. I instinctively stepped back, and when I looked at his face, it was John. He looked emaciated, and as if he hadn't been living well. "John."
You've raised Sophia to be so big. Were you waiting for me?
He was saying things that made no sense. Just as John reached out to us, my father, seeing this, rushed over.
Why are you here? Leave.
Wait. I came to pick up Emily.
John claimed his married life had been dreadful. Nancy had given birth, but they had no money and were living in poverty. DNA tests confirmed that the baby was indeed John's child, but debt collectors were causing them trouble. When Nancy tried to return to her previous company, Mary personally came out and turned her away. Seeing the company thriving and harmonious without her drove Nancy to a meltdown.
Why, I'm more suited to be in charge.
Please leave. You're causing distress to the staff. There is no place for you here anymore.
Mary calmly handed Nancy over to the security guards as she threw a tantrum. John and Nancy's relationship was at its worst, and John expressed a desire to leave Nancy and the baby and come back.
She used to be so beautiful, and now she's just a mess. Hey, Emily, come back home. If you're there, I can kick Nancy out.
What are you talking about? Trying to abandon your new family just shows you haven't changed at all. I will never let Sophia see you again. Don't come near us ever. John's face crumbled into despair.
You've become too much like a mother. It's terrible how you've lost all your innocence.
If you don't leave, I'll call the police.
My father slammed his hand on the wall, his voice booming with authority, which seemed to frighten John enough to make him flee in haste.
I'm sorry about our foolish son.
When I told my in-laws, they apologized profusely and agreed to hire a security company.
If he lurks around again, we won't hold back.
With that, my father, a former wrestling enthusiast, began practicing again, almost making me worry more for John than for us. Though it seems unlikely that I'll have anything to do with John and Nancy again, the intense stress they caused me often appears in my dreams, reminding me how desperately I want that to be the last time. In my arms, Sophia sleeps peacefully. Even without a father, she has strong allies in her grandparents and in-laws. She will surely be happy. Above all, I am committed to living positively for the life in front of me.
While I was on a video call, something suddenly smacked into the back of my head. As I was startled and turned around, there stood my mother-in-law, Susan, with a nasty smirk on her face.
You seem to have a lot of free time, chatting on the computer. The maid should get to cleaning.
Apparently, Susan had thrown a dirty, wet rag at me. I was so shocked that I couldn't find the words. Ever since we started living together, I, working full-time, have been overwhelmed by Susan forcing all the household chores on me. It's hard enough being burdened with all the housework, but to be her ass like this is just too much. Tears of frustration and sadness were about to come, as Susan looked on, laughing gleefully at my misery. What turned the tables was a voice from the video call asking, "Do you have any last words?" The moment she heard that, Susan's face turned pale, and she started trembling. "My name is Claire. I'm a 27-year-old office worker, and I married my husband, Michael, who is 2 years older than me, 6 months ago. Since marrying, I've been living with my mother-in-law in her house. The reason I ended up living with my mother-in-law was because my father-in-law passed away. Just before we got married, my father-in-law died in an accident, leaving my mother-in-law living alone in a large house. Concerned that my aging mother-in-law would be living alone from now on, Michael, who was then my fiancé, suggested we live with her.
Mom's never lived alone before. It'd be tough on her to start now at her age, and I worry something might happen to her. So, I was thinking, would it be okay if we lived with her?
Michael is an only child, so maybe it's natural for him to worry about his parent. Thinking this, I agreed to live with my mother-in-law. However, my mother-in-law, in her mid-50s, turned out to be full of energy, to the point where I couldn't understand my husband's concerns. Since we started living together, she has been pushing all the household chores onto me and goes out almost every day to enjoy herself. Despite me working full-time.
Make sure you clean thoroughly today. And don't forget to mow the lawn. Have it finished by evening. Of course, that includes preparing dinner too. Okay, I'm off.
Wait, what? I have work and can't possibly do all that, Susan, and she's already gone. Naturally, with the limited time I had before going to work, it was impossible to finish both cleaning and mowing the lawn. I had no choice but to continue with the chores after returning home from work. That was my plan, but right after I returned from work, my mother-in-law came back too. She noticed that not all the chores were done and started to nag and sneer at me.
You're still not done. Honestly, you're so inefficient. What have you been doing all day? Oh, and don't use work as an excuse, please.
Despite not doing any household chores herself, my mother-in-law, Susan, had the audacity to lecture me, which was honestly infuriating. But arguing back would only prolong the conversation, so I remained silent and downcast, listening to her smugly dish out one sarcastic comment after another.
Whatever. Just get dinner ready quickly. Michael will be home soon. It's unthinkable to not have dinner ready when a tired husband comes home from work.
After her tirade, Susan seemed satisfied and left the area. The delay in preparing dinner was due to her long talk, a fact that left me feeling unjustified as I began cooking. Thus, after only a few months of living with her, I found myself regretting the decision to live with my mother-in-law, as she continued to boss me around and make snide remarks daily. My husband, oblivious to the strained relationship between Susan and me, was busy working at the company run by his grandmother. This company, originally established and expanded by his grandfather, was being managed by his grandmother after the grandfather's death. There had been plans to pass the leadership to my father-in-law as the grandmother aged, but he passed away before this could happen. Since my mother-in-law, who had never worked in the company, couldn't take over, my husband became the successor. Michael is busier than regular employees because he is also training to take over the company, in addition to his normal duties. Until he is fully capable of replacing the president, his grandmother continues to lead the company. Being the president for many years, the grandmother is very straightforward and dislikes dishonesty. often adopting a strict attitude towards herself and others. Susan, having been strictly disciplined by her own mother-in-law initially, seems to have a fear of her, showing discomfort at the mere mention of her name. On the other hand, I found that my preferences and thoughts were similar to the grandmother's, and we got along well from the start of my marriage. Fortunately, our relationship wasn't as close as a typical mother-in-law and daughter-in-law, which perhaps helped us to quickly warm up to each other. And before I knew it, I was visiting grandmother-in-law on my own during holidays. Susan, disliking the close relationship between her mother-in-law and me, started making snide remarks more frequently after realizing how well I got along with her.
Claire, I see you're close with your grandmother-in-law. She's making an effort to spend time with you despite her busy schedule. Don't you realize you're getting in her way? Maybe you should show some restraint.
And perhaps to keep me from visiting my grandmother-in-law, Susan started to exploit me even more than before.
I'm home. What? Dinner's not ready yet. Looks like the cleaning isn't done either. Isn't your efficiency lacking?
As soon as she returned home, Susan looked down at me with a scowl. I'm sorry, but I just got back from work myself, so.
I don't want to hear excuses. Just get it done quickly.
For me, working full-time and sometimes doing overtime, it's impossible to manage all the household chores perfectly. I wish I could at least buy some ready-made meals from the supermarket on the days I work late, but Susan insists. I don't want to eat something that looks unhealthy. All meals should be homemade. Exhausted by dealing with Susan's unreasonable demands, I took the opportunity when she was out to talk to my husband, Michael. Susan won't listen to me. Can you talk to her, Michael? It's impossible for me to manage all the household chores by myself when we both work. We need her help. However, even when I pleaded, my husband wouldn't listen.
Sorry, but I'm busy and tired from work. Can't you complain somewhere else?
I think he didn't want to hear me speak ill of Susan. My husband, training to be the successor at his grandmother's company, seems to be tasked with various jobs and literally works from morning till night, often even on weekends. Reluctant to burden my extremely busy husband, I couldn't bring myself to discuss Susan with him any further. In the midst of these uncomfortable days, I received a call from my grandmother-in-law on a day off.
There's something I can't figure out on my computer. Claire, I hate to bother you, but could you help me? Is now a good time?
I just finished my morning chores, so it's fine. I'll help if I can. Having just taken a break from my chores, I was happy to help my grandmother-in-law. I switched the call to a video chat and began remotely assisting her with her computer. Click this button and you'll get to this screen. Then, if you click OK here. As I was explaining and navigating the screen, suddenly, something cold smacked into the back of my head. What? Surprised by the suddenness, I quickly turned around. There stood Susan, smirking unpleasantly. Then, noticing a foul smell coming from below, I looked down to find a dirty, wet rat. Touching the back of my head where I felt wetness, my hand came away smelling foul, indicating Susan had thrown the dirty rag at me.
Chatting on the computer. You seem to have plenty of free time. The maid should get to cleaning right away.
I was profoundly shocked and speechless, both from being called a maid and having the dirty rag thrown at me. I couldn't understand any of it, including the usual harassment from Susan. Why should I be treated this way? What had I done? These thoughts swirled in my mind until I was momentarily dazed. With Susan looking down on me with a smug grin, saying nothing. An uncomfortable silence filled the house, broken only by my grandmother-in-law's voice.
Is there anything else you'd like to say before we finish?
Her voice came from the computer screen I was on a video call with. At that moment, Susan, realizing I was talking to her mother-in-law, went pale and began to tremble.
What, that voice? Could it be you, mother-in-law? You were talking to her.
It seemed Susan hadn't realized I was on a video call, as the screen showed remote control operations and not the grandmother-in-law's face. From the other side of the screen, her stern voice came through.
It's not just your voice I heard. I might not know how it looks from there, but I can see everything from here. I saw you throw the rag at Claire, clear as day.
Realizing her actions had been seen, Susan's face turned ashen, her mouth opening and closing in shock. Ignoring her, the grandmother-in-law might have ended the remote control session because her face then appeared on the computer screen. Looking as stern as ever, glaring sharply at Susan.
Really, hurling insults and even doing something as dreadful as this in front of me. What were you thinking? I think you owe me an explanation.
It's not what it looks like. I was just trying to scold her for neglecting her chores.
Susan, sweating profusely and flustered, responded to the grandmother-in-law's questioning. The grandmother-in-law stared at her with an icy gaze.
What nonsense is this? When I called, Claire said she had finished her morning chores. Are you suggesting she lied? And even if so, what's with the rag you threw at her? Is that your idea of discipline? And how do you explain calling her a maid? Do you actually think of Claire as a maid? Enough with the jokes.
It's just.
Susan was so intimidated by the relentless questioning that she couldn't provide a straight answer, her eyes darting around. Perhaps exasperated, the grandmother-in-law sighed heavily.
Enough. It seems I need to re-educate you. I'm coming over right now, so just wait there. You know what will happen if you try to run, right?
With that, the grandmother-in-law ended the video call. Susan stood frozen in front of the computer, her face a shade of desperate blue, speechless. Her demeanor was almost like how I had been earlier, stunned by the harassment I received. About 30 minutes later, both the grandmother-in-law and Michael arrived at our home. Having briefly heard from the grandmother-in-law during the drive, Michael had a stern look.
Well then, let's hear again. What exactly were you thinking with all this?
Though Susan had remained motionless since the call ended, she started trembling when confronted by the arriving grandmother-in-law.
It's really not what it seems. I wasn't bullying Claire. I just told her to take care of the housework instead of just playing around.
I ran out of my patience with my mill, who kept making excuses even in this situation. And I burst out in frustration at Susan. Enough. You dump all the housework on me and go out to enjoy yourself. How is that fair? And for your information, I work full-time. I'm not out playing. There's no way I can meet your standards of housekeeping. Working 5 days a week from morning till night. How can one person be expected to clean every corner of the house every single day? It's unreasonable to expect me to cook a full course meal for every meal, mow the lawn and water the plants daily, and never miss laundry and ironing. My frustration unleashed, I also laid bare to the grandmother-in-law and Michael how unreasonable Susan's demands and actions had been.
What the, Mom? You've been putting Claire through all this despite having all the time in the world because you're not working.
Michael, shocked by my words, began to confront Susan. With a stunned husband and a disapproving grandmother-in-law glaring at her, Susan shrank in size. Realizing Susan had nothing to say, Michael turned to me.
It seems I've made a terrible mistake. Claire, I'm truly sorry for not taking your words seriously. I had no idea you were suffering like this. I just assumed Mom was handling the chores. I should have realized sooner and addressed Mom's behavior. I'm so sorry.
Michael, looking pale, apologized.
You probably don't want anything to do with her anymore, right? Let's stop living with her and just be on our own.
Surprised by Michael's unexpected suggestion, my emotions shifted from joy to astonishment. Really? Are you sure? I hesitantly asked, wondering if I was just hearing things I wanted to hear. When I fearfully confirmed this thought, my husband nodded strongly and said, "Of course." My husband is serious, not lying, about trying to help me deal with my mother-in-law. Feeling supported and relieved, tears welled up in my eyes. However, Susan, witnessing our conversation, did not seem pleased with the development and suddenly became infuriated.
What's this? Michael and Claire, both of you spouting such nonsense. Don't you know it's only natural for a daughter-in-law to perfect the housework? Serving the in-laws' home is a daughter-in-law's duty. Breaking up the cohabitation is out of the question.
Susan insisted she had done nothing wrong, and that the fault lay with the daughter-in-law who couldn't manage the house properly. Her self-righteous rant was incredibly selfish. I was about to retort to Susan's outrageous claims, but the grandmother-in-law cut in sharply before I could speak.
The only one talking nonsense here is you. If it's so natural for a daughter-in-law to serve her new family, then you should be the first to help out in our home.
Chastised by the grandmother-in-law, Susan's previous bravado disappeared, and she trembled with fear.
But, Michael, help me. I enjoy living with you, and your grandmother's house has maids, so there's nothing for me to do. Tell her I want to keep living with you guys.
Susan pleaded with Michael, crying, but he looked at her coldly.
Sure, having someone else do all the work while you play must be comfortable. But don't you see how hard Claire is struggling because of it? I don't care how important you think a mother-in-law is. Why can't you think of helping out?
Michael's logical rebuttal left Susan biting her lip in frustration. The grandmother-in-law, witnessing this, cut Susan down further.
Really? How shameful, clinging to your son like that. All right, if you're so keen on living together, then I'll live with you. Michael, arrange for the movers. Don't worry about the cost. Just make sure it can be done soon.
Commanding Michael efficiently, the grandmother-in-law caused Susan to panic.
Not that. Anything but that, please.
Despite Susan's desperate resistance, the grandmother-in-law's chauffeur dragged her to the car and transported her to the grandmother-in-law's house. As it was, my mother-in-law was forcibly taken to my grandmother-in-law's house with only her body. Susan's screams echoed like death throes. A few days later, The movers arranged by Michael transferred all of Susan's belongings to the grandmother-in-law's house, where Susan began her new cohabitation. Susan was being strictly trained in household and company chores by the grandmother-in-law.
Is that all you've done? You're too slow. At this rate, you'll never finish. Hurry up, then get home to start dinner.
I can't take it anymore.
Susan, overwhelmed by the variety of tasks, lived a miserable daily life. As an aside, Susan had a habit of overspending and had used up most of her husband's inheritance. Thus, no matter how much she disliked the grandmother-in-law's house, she couldn't afford to find a new place and move out. Once, Susan tried to flee and sneak into our home. However, Michael had changed the locks right after evicting her, so her key no longer worked. Realizing this, Susan banged on the door, shouting,
Michael, help me. Let me in. Please hide me.
Despite Susan's loud pleas, Michael and I ignored her until the grandmother-in-law arrived to take her back. Since then, we haven't seen Susan. Living alone in the spacious in-laws' home, Michael and I were relieved of stress and enjoyed our freedom. Perhaps the elimination of stress helped, and in time we were able to have a child. Awaiting the child's arrival, I now live a very peaceful life.
Emily, where are you now? Why aren't you answering the phone?
As soon as the call connected, my mother shouted angrily, I'm at home now. I answered calmly, undisturbed by my mother's anger.
Why did you leave me behind? Don't you care about your parent?
My mother was clearly agitated. I sighed softly before expressing my feelings. I can't live with you anymore, Mom. That's why I've decided to move out. My statement surprised her. She was clearly taken aback.
What are you talking about all of a sudden? Do you hate me now? I won't be able to manage if you're gone. What should I do when I return from the hospital? I need care, you know.
By this time, I already knew the whole truth about my mother. I am Emily, 36 years old. I work for a major corporation in the city. A few years ago, for some reason, working remotely became my main way of working. My parents divorced when I was young, and my mother raised me on her own. I don't remember what my father looked like at all, but I heard that he was the same age as my mother. According to my mom, my father was quite the womanizer. He treated her like a maid and was always complaining. Eventually, he left to be with his mistress. What a terrible man. Now it seems impossible to get in touch with him. My mother threw away any photos of my father a long time ago. After the divorce, my mother got custody. It seems there was no particular conflict with my father. She took me and raised me with care. I am filled with gratitude towards her. Thanks to her, I was able to graduate from college and get a job at a major company. I grew up receiving a lot of love from my mother, so I never felt lonely. Besides, I have no desire to meet my father now. My mother has always said about him,
That man was really no good. So think of it as if you never had a father from the start. You are my pride and joy, raised with all my care.
When I heard about how my father treated my mother and his affairs with other women, I was filled with anger towards him, feeling so sorry for my mother. I hardly ever felt envious seeing my friends' parents together at school events like Parents' Days or Sports Days. I lived as if my father didn't exist, just as my mother had said. Then, as I started working and living on my own, I led a busy yet fulfilling life. Around the time I turned 26, something happened. My mother had an accident and was forced to live in a wheelchair. It was an unfortunate accident that severely injured her legs, rendering her unable to walk. She had to quit her job, which was a great frustration for her. My mother, who was always cheerful, became gloomy after the accident. It took away her freedom and her smile. Gradually, she became mentally distressed, had to visit the hospital more often, and lost a lot of weight. Then she asked me to come back home to take care of her, so I returned to my family house for her care. She probably felt very vulnerable mentally. I took a week off work to devote myself to caregiving. Initially, I thought I would return to work once she got better. Since I came back home, my mom has been smiling more often. I felt relieved that I could go back to work, but when I told my mom about it, she wouldn't allow me to return to work.
Are you going back to work, Emily? Don't leave me here alone again, will you? That would be cruel.
While saying this, my mother clung to me. Mom, if that's the case, I'll talk to my company, so just wait. I was perplexed by my mother's plea, but I couldn't just abandon the woman who had raised me single-handedly. Moreover, I could see her mobility and mental strength declining. I talked to my company and decided to switch to working remotely with shorter hours until my mother's condition improved. However, afterward, my mom became extremely uncomfortable with me being alone and would constantly hover around me even when I was working in my room. During online meetings via the laptop camera, I had to ask her to leave the room because it's not good for others to see her, but she always stayed where she could see me. It felt like I was under constant surveillance, which was not pleasant, but I had no choice. My mother continued with her rehab, but there was no sign of improvement in her condition. Consequently, I had no prospects for returning to the main office, which troubled me. Prioritizing my mother's care, I spent these years without engaging in any romantic relationships, and now it's been 10 years. Currently, my mother is 65, and her dependency on me has worsened. Whenever I have to leave the house even for a bit, she becomes very upset, causing a lot of trouble. Calming her down takes so much time that living alone again seemed impossible. One day, we went to the hospital for her routine checkup. The doctor who always sees my mom is a male physician in his 40s named Dr. Walter Green. He has been treating her for 10 years. My mother went into the examination room to be checked. Right away, I stepped outside to take a call from a work colleague. After finishing the call and as I was heading back to the examination room, a female doctor approached me in the hallway.
Excuse me, but you are related to Sarah, right?
Yes, Sarah is my mother. Is something wrong with her? I was taken aback, being suddenly approached by an unknown doctor.
Sorry for the delay. I'm Kate Hudson. I'm Sarah's attending physician, and I work directly under Walter Green, the doctor in charge here at the hospital. Actually, I have something to discuss regarding Sarah. If you have the time, I'd like to talk to you about it, if that's okay.
Feeling anxious, I immediately agreed to spare time with her. Dr. Hudson then led me with a serious expression to a separate room, which seemed to be used as a small conference or consultation room.
Please, have a seat,
Dr. Hudson instructed, so I sat down. She began to speak with a serious look on her face.
I understand that you have been caring for your mother, Sarah, at your family home.
Yes, that's correct. For about the last 10 years, I've been working from home and taking care of my mother. Then, Dr. Hudson looked down and murmured in a low voice,
This is a bit hard for me to say, but...
What she disclosed next was shocking. Though I doubted my ears, Dr. Hudson led me to a certain room. What I saw there was a shocking scene. Dr. Hudson and I returned to the original room and sat down again. She then started speaking with a grave expression.
You should distance yourself from Sarah right away.
Hearing the doctor's words, anger towards my mother welled up inside me. That day, I showed my appreciation to her and left the hospital. Of course, I went straight home without stopping by my mother's place. As soon as I got home, I started preparing to leave. The image of my mother that I saw at the hospital kept flashing through my mind. About 3 hours had passed, and I was about to finish packing. During that time, my mother had called several times. Probably she was anxious because the checkup or rehab was over and I wasn't at the hospital. But I continued to ignore her calls. After I had finished packing, I finally answered my mother's call.
Emily, where are you now? Why aren't you answering the phone?
My mother shouted loudly as soon as the call connected. I'm at home. I replied calmly, not disturbed by her anger.
Why did you leave me behind? Don't you care about your parent?
My mother was clearly agitated. I sighed softly before expressing my feelings. I can't live with you anymore, Mom. That's why I've decided to leave this house. My statement made her eyes widen in shock. She seemed pretty taken aback.
What are you saying all of a sudden? Do you hate me now? If you leave, I won't be able to manage on my own. What am I supposed to do when I get back from the hospital? I need care, you know.
I confidently told my mother something. Mom, the truth is, your legs healed a long time ago, and you can walk normally, right? I know that you don't need a wheelchair or any care. At my words, my mother raised her voice.
How did you know that? Who told you?
I told my mother about what Dr. Hudson had shared with me and what I had seen at the hospital. Dr. Hudson said that recent tests showed no abnormalities in my mother's body, and it was puzzling why she couldn't walk. After some thought, Dr. Hudson concluded that it might be my mother's own belief. It seems there are cases where believing I can't walk makes it a reality. In that case, she would need mental care and my help, Dr. Hudson explained. Then she said, "Come with me," and led me to the door of the examination room where my mother was. She opened the door slightly and said, "Please look at this." To my astonishment, my mother was sitting in a chair without any problem in the examination room. The wheelchair was set aside, and her cane was lying nearby. Right after saying, "Thank you, Dr. Green," as always, my mother stood up from the chair on her own. Without using the cane, she got up from the chair, put on her jacket, and prepared to leave. My mother, who usually gets a plaster at the hospital, walked on her own to throw away the trash from the plaster application. Seeing my mother's light footsteps, I was speechless. She seemed completely unaware that I was watching. Afterwards, Dr. Hudson and I moved away a bit so as not to be noticed by my mother. Then my mother nonchalantly came out of the room in her wheelchair, and she headed toward the adjacent rehab facility. Dr. Hudson approached me and asked,
Emily, are you okay?
I stood there dazed for a moment before realizing my mother wasn't actually unable to walk, nor did she believe she couldn't. She could walk but was pretending she couldn't, demanding care from me. Amid my swirling emotions of anger and frustration, Dr. Hudson put her hand on my shoulder and whispered, "Stay strong." Following Dr. Hudson's advice, I quickly packed to leave my family home. While I was recounting the events at the hospital, my mother listened silently. But after a few minutes, she started telling the truth.
The car accident did happen, and I wasn't lying. I was injured badly enough to need welfare. However, after about 1.5 years of intensive rehab, I could walk with a cane. I'm sorry for keeping silent.
Hearing this, I felt a surge of anger from deep within. What were those 10 years I spent caring for you all about? You could walk with a cane after about 1.5 years. Don't joke with me. Then, over the phone, my mother responded,
You would have left if you knew, right? You seemed busy with work, and I hated that.
I knew my mother loved me as her daughter from our daily life. But her love became excessive, making me care for her so I wouldn't leave her side.
I worry about you, Emily, and I felt lonely on my own.
My mother said that, but over these 10 years, time had passed. Some of my colleagues have been promoted and are earning good salaries. Others are married and have built happy families. I had to give up on my career and marriage to care for my mother, only to realize much of that time was wasted. The more I thought about it, the more frustrated I became, and eventually I started crying. I told her I had no intention of caring for her any longer. I'm leaving our family home today. Don't contact me ever again. Got it? I said firmly, hung up the phone, and blocked my mother's number. Months later, I was at a hospital. As I was about to go home after a checkup, a man hurried towards me.
It's been a while?
On closer inspection, it was Dr. Green, my mother's former physician. But he looked much thinner than before, and his face was marked by exhaustion. Dr. Green had known about my mother's recovery and had been paid by her to falsely diagnose her as disabled. He had taken cash from my mother that day too. However, recently Dr. Hudson spoke about this matter at a meeting, and it was exposed to the whole hospital, leading to his dismissal. It was also discovered that he had forged diagnosis reports. He mentioned he might be arrested soon. It seems like he's already facing the decision of having his medical license revoked. Yet, he insisted to me I did nothing wrong.
The money I received wasn't a bribe or a reward. That was hush money Sarah paid on your behalf. That's how I see it.
This was a grave mistake. Dr. Green was trying to shift the blame to me out of fear of being arrested. I raised my voice in opposition to Dr. Green's claims. What are you talking about? That's nonsense. Suddenly, Dr. Green's demeanor changed, and he confronted me aggressively.
You won't listen to me. I'll tell the police the same thing I told you. You know what will happen if you make any unnecessary moves. Right.
Dr. Green was threatening me. I could feel my heartbeat quickening. It was clear that Dr. Green's story lacked evidence, but there was no proof that I wasn't involved either. Then an older man came over and stood in front of me protectively. At that moment, Dr. Green's face turned pale, and he exclaimed,
The hospital CEO. Why are you here?
I was also surprised to realize the man standing before me was the hospital CEO.
What are you doing to my daughter, Dr. Green?
Your daughter?
Dr. Green exclaimed loudly. At the same time, I was in disbelief and looked at the man. The man before me was the hospital CEO and, as it turned out, my father. The father I had heard about from my mother. The father my mother had divorced when I was young was the CEO of this hospital. However, even in front of the hospital CEO, Dr. Green continues to spout nonsense.
I was only writing the diagnosis reports because this woman threatened me. As a father, don't you think it's important to help your daughter make positive choices and avoid getting her becoming a criminal? I need your help.
Dr. Green begged my father for help, but it had no effect on my father.
Ridiculous. You two have made enemies of both the hospital and the authorities. You've been deceiving my daughter, who cared for 10 years. You conspired to receive disability benefits. You fraud, deserve to be punished.
Dr. Green collapsed to his knees. Then I felt a tap on my shoulder from behind. Turning around, I saw my mother standing there with a menacing expression. Of course, she's not sitting in a wheelchair or using a cane. She's standing energetically.
What are you two doing?
My mother glared at me and my father as she spoke.
I followed Dr. Green because he was looking for you. I thought it would lead me to Emily, but it seems I've walked into quite the scene.
I was chilled by my mother's persistence.
I won't hand Emily over to someone like you. Emily, let's go.
She yelled at my father with a sense of madness. Mom, stop it, I said, shaking off her hand and revealing my true feelings. I know everything now. All the stories I heard from you were lies. My mother looked down, silenced. She had been feeding me lies since the divorce to prevent me from meeting my father. All the tales of my father treating her like a maid and leaving due to an affair were completely fabricated. My father, a dedicated doctor, had always worked tirelessly. My mother must have known this when she married him, but she changed after I was born. She decided on her own that he was a failure as a father, and she abruptly took me and left the house. So it was not my father, but my mother who left. After the negotiations, my mother gained custody because my father, despite having a good income, didn't have time for childcare. However, my father had been sending me a lot of child support money. I was surprised to learn about this when I talked to my father for the first time about it. He wanted to meet me many times, but my mother kept refusing, saying, "Emily doesn't want to see you." I was able to attend college without financial difficulties thanks to the child support from my father. Not because my mother worked late to earn my tuition as she claimed. In reality, she worked part-time during the day and spent her nights out drinking in the entertainment district. Suddenly, my mother sharply asked, "Do you have proof?"
Can't you just check the bank statements or ask the places you work?
Then she looked down and started to cry. "I can no longer live with you, Mom. In fact, I can't. I'm sorry, but I have to sever ties with you now. Goodbye."
Wait a minute, Emily, Emily.
My mother called out my name loudly, but it no longer mattered. Having declared my disownment, I left the hospital with my father. Afterward, Dr. Green was arrested and stripped of his medical license. He had repeatedly forged diagnosis reports, resulting in a prison sentence. My mother, having paid the doctor for false reports and submitting fraudulent documents to receive disability benefits, was ordered to repay all the received benefits plus interest. Furthermore, she was charged with participating in fraud. I hope she truly acknowledges and atones for her crimes. This ordeal caused me so much stress that I ended up mentally exhausted and had to seek hospital treatment. Now I am working at the main office and managing my job while continuing my hospital visits. I later visited Dr. Hudson, who had enlightened me about my mother, to express my gratitude. Though my father and I had a miraculous reunion, we began to communicate regularly, slowly restoring our genuine parent-child relationship. One day after work, I unexpectedly met my father, and we decided to dine out. Sitting in the restaurant, he spoke.
We can reclaim lost time, but there's plenty ahead of us. From now on, Emily, live life the way you want.
His words resonated deeply with me. I vowed to cherish the time ahead and live true to myself.
What's so busy about being a housewife?
My husband, Ken, scoffs at me, a full-time housewife. Joining in, my mother-in-law, Melanie, laughs and says, "You're just a parasite." It's not just Melanie who's barged into our home. On top of that, I've been saddled with taking care of my dementia-stricken grandmother-in-law, Holly, and instead of gratitude, they complain about everything I do. I'm also working hard to raise our daughter, and they call me a parasite? Fine then. I'll show you who's really in charge here. My name is Shelley. Every Valentine's Day, I buy myself chocolates and enjoy them. But this year, I ended up with a bad case of skin trouble from eating too much. At 40, it takes longer for these blemishes to heal. I'm getting old. No, maybe having pimples is a sign of youth. Yeah, right. Back when my skin was a little bit more youthful in my 30s. Ken came home from work with his mother, Melanie, and grandmother, Holly, and said,
"Starting today, we're all going to live here together."
It's needless to say that I was speechless at his beaming declaration. What do you mean? I haven't heard a word about this. My tone towards Ken became unintentionally harsh.
Mom broke her arm.
Ken said, glancing at Melanie's right hand.
Oh no, I really did it this time.
Melanie laughed openly, raising her bandaged right hand.
You know Mom has been taking care of Grandma with dementia, right?
Yeah, I know, but as I had a bad feeling about this, I glanced at Melanie. With this hand, I can't take care of her, can I? She said with a smug look.
Well, unlike you, Shelley, I'm quite adept at handling everything, but given my age, I can't take care of her while injured. It wouldn't be fair to Mom either.
Oh boy. Melanie subtly but surely looked down on me, implying that I'm inefficient. I really can't stand this part of Melanie. Melanie graduated from college and once claimed she led various successful projects at a major company. However, in reality, she was mainly a receptionist who retired early to get married. She claims she left at 6 p.m. every day because she was so competent. But it's more likely because her job of serving tea ended when visitors left. On the other hand, I graduated from a vocational school and used to be a hairstylist. Melanie mocked that.
Such a path seems like something a not-so-smart person would choose.
When I later became pregnant and decided to quit my job to prioritize childcare, Melanie lectured me.
I balanced work and childcare.
If I had a job serving tea until 6 p.m., I could balance work and childcare too. Is that so? Though internally furious, I smiled and let it slide. I've been avoiding visiting Ken's family, saying, "Our daughter catches colds easily in unfamiliar places and haven't shown my face for the past 2 years." Ken understood, and Melanie seemed fine with Ken visiting alone, showing no desire to see her granddaughter. This way, I've managed to maintain a comfortable distance from Melanie. But now, living together, I held my head in my hands. If Melanie injured her dominant hand, it would indeed be difficult for her to care for her mother with dementia. I understand why she thinks our support is necessary. Unfortunately, I completely understand Melanie's point and the situation. But still, why did Ken bring them to our house without even discussing it with me? You know I don't get along with Melanie, right? I understand the situation, but you could have at least discussed it with me. I began to feel distrust towards Ken. Ken, on the other hand, said, "You're a housewife, so you can take care of Grandma, right?" Even though I'm a full-time housewife, I'm also taking care of our 2-year-old daughter almost entirely by myself. Yet, with Melanie and Holly already set on staying, having brought their suitcases, I couldn't tell them to leave. Reluctantly, I agreed to the arrangement and ended up taking on the responsibility of caring for Holly. I thought I just had to endure it until Melanie's injury healed. But even after her injury healed, Melanie showed no signs of leaving and continued to stay in our home. She left all the caregiving for Holly to me, even though it's her own mother. When I gently asked her to help with the caregiving since her injury was healed, she refused, saying she had work. Melanie's work is stocking shelves at a grocery store twice a week from 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. She had adjusted her work schedule to accommodate caregiving, so saying she can't help because of work is just an excuse. She claims her boss values her highly and says she's indispensable to the company, but it's hard to believe they'd say that to someone who works part-time twice a week. Melanie's tall tales are obvious. Yet, she often tells me, "Unlike you, I didn't quit my job just because I got pregnant. Honestly, I'd like to quit too because of my age, but they won't let me because I'm so valuable," and laughs. Yes, yes. It's amazing to be a college graduate and an expert at stocking shelves. I feel like snapping back but keep quiet. Despite her self-proclaimed career woman status, she doesn't show any such signs at home. She always mishears things on the phone and doesn't know how to operate the DVD player. She even struggles with the TV remote. I doubt she can use a computer. She doesn't know how to use YouTube either. She hardly does any personal care tasks, or perhaps she's unable to. She leaves her clothes lying around and doesn't clean up hair in the bathtub, showing no consideration for others. Her conversations don't make her seem competent. After all, she graduated from the only private women's college in her rural area. It's fine if she stays with us forever, he laughs. In fact, he started to get angry with me for not wanting to live together, saying I was being too cold to his mother. Ken used to be a kind person. That's why I liked him. But ever since Melanie moved in, she's been pampering him nonstop. We had agreed on Melanie didn't want to do anything herself, so she also ingrained in Ken that a wife should take care of her husband and his mother. As a result, Ken stopped helping with even the simplest tasks like cleaning up after meals or taking out the trash, and he started demanding that I bring him his clothes when he bathed instead of getting them himself. Like Melanie, he began to make a mess of the house and wouldn't clean up, saying, "Cleaning is your job." With his increased drinking, he became more short-tempered at night, often raising his voice over trivial matters, making it hard to have a conversation. I tried not to anger Ken for the sake of our daughter's upbringing, so I rarely voiced my own thoughts. This only made Ken more arrogant, and he became a troublesome tyrant, all because of Melanie. Holly's dementia had worsened significantly since our last visit to her house, and she had become more aggressive, often using harsh language or throwing things. Sometimes she would hit me hard on the head with her fist. Even witnessing this, Ken and Melanie would just laugh.
Grandma gets angry because you're inefficient.
When Ken said that, I was on the verge of tears from anger. Despite my daily struggles with childcare and caregiving, Melanie would ask me to rent DVDs for her to watch some old movies. It's already tough enough to go shopping. I don't have time to rent pointless DVDs. My sleep hours have significantly decreased lately. But if I honestly said this, Melanie would get angry and tell Ken, "Shelley was mean to me." Then Ken would scold me, and no one would listen to or understand my situation. How did it come to this? I was getting more depressed each day. I was reaching my physical and mental limits. One day, after Holly hit me, Ken got angry and said, "Why do you always make Grandma mad? You're really inefficient." I had simply wiped Holly's mouth after she spilled some food. Holly got angry, shouting, "Don't touch me." When I stopped touching her, she then said, "Wipe my mouth. It's gross," and hit me. I don't think I'm inefficient. If you think it's so easy, then you take care of her. You're just watching from the sidelines without doing anything. She's your grandmother. Technically, I have no obligation to take care of her.
Are you stupid? I'm too busy to take care of her.
I'm busy too. Ken laughed at me with contempt as I shouted with tears in my eyes.
What? What's so busy about being a housewife?
Melanie immediately laughed at Ken's words.
Just a parasite, right?
A parasite? Me. I'm doing all the childcare, housework, and caregiving, and letting you live in this house, and you call me a parasite. I won't forgive this anymore. Then from today, I'm quitting being a wife and daughter-in-law.
What?
At my words, Ken and Melanie looked momentarily bewildered. You mean you're quitting being my wife? Planning to get a divorce? You can't possibly do that. Ken laughed. I calmly said, "Yes, I'm leaving."
What?
Ignoring Ken's bewildered look, I opened the cabinet behind me. I took out a paper and slapped it on the table. Divorce papers. Sign them.
Are you serious?
Ken alternated between looking at the divorce papers and me, gradually turning pale.
She's not serious.
Melanie tried to sound confident, but her voice was shaky. What's wrong, Melanie? Worried that you'll lose your important caregiver?
No, there's no way you can get a divorce. How do you plan to live as a housewife with no money?
How can you even say that?
Huh?
Ken seemed to realize what I was about to say and warned Melanie.
Don't provoke her any further.
Did you know this house is in my name?
What?
Melanie looked dumbfounded, and Ken held his head in his hands. I inherited this land and house from my late grandfather, so we renovated it and moved in.
Didn't you say Ken built it?
Yes, that's what he told you at his request.
What?
Melanie, you think a man living in a house owned by his wife is pathetic, right?
Of course, the man should earn more and build at least one house.
That's why Ken couldn't tell you the truth.
Huh?
When we had our child, we decided to move from our apartment to a house. Coincidentally, my grandfather passed away that same year, leaving me the land and house. So we decided to move there, but Ken hesitated. I don't want Mom to criticize me for living in a house in your name, he said. Melanie has an outdated view of gender roles, believing men should be masculine and financially support women. She's the kind who'd get angry at the TV over stories about couples splitting the bill on dates, calling them unmanly. At the same time, she claims to be a modern woman, saying women should be independent and active in society. If she found out Ken hadn't built the house and was living in one in my name, she'd undoubtedly belittle him. She'd likely demand we rebuild the house with Ken's money. Though we were the ones living in it, we'd undoubtedly face constant nagging. To avoid that scenario, we decided together to let Melanie believe Ken built the house.
I didn't raise my son to be so unmanly.
Upon learning the truth, Melanie looked surprisingly dejected, glancing at Ken with disdain. Ken, feeling embarrassed, avoided eye contact. If our relationship had been good, I would have defended Ken, saying to ignore Melanie's outdated views, but this time I had no reason to support him. So, could you all please leave my house? I said with a bright smile, and Ken and Melanie's faces tensed.
Wait. I understand if Mom and Grandma leave, but I'm your husband, and I haven't agreed to a divorce.
Ken resisted the idea of leaving. If he were kicked out, he'd either have to rent a place or move back to his parents' house. Realistically, moving back to his parents' house would be more feasible, but it was less convenient than our house, and commuting without a car would be a hassle for Ken. I completely understood why Ken didn't want to go back. Melanie also showed no signs of wanting to leave. For Melanie, it was likely the fear of losing her caregiver and having to take care of her mother again. Think it over, she began to say. No, you'll be leaving, I replied. With that, I started moving their luggage out to the yard.
Wait, what are you doing?
Melanie protested. It's odd to have other people's belongings in my house. I'm decluttering. Ken and Melanie tried to stop me, but I continued moving their things outside. Finally, I shoved Ken, causing him to stumble and fall into the yard. I didn't push Melanie or Holly, but there was a lot of shoving to force them outside. As I quietly closed the window, Ken and Melanie started shouting.
Let us back in.
In the chaos, Holly, not understanding the situation, was in a panic, yelling, "Play! Play!" while repeatedly hitting and kicking Ken and Melanie.
Help us, Shelley.
Unable to do anything about Holly's outbursts, Ken and Melanie just took it.
Please stop, Grandma.
Ken echoed, but I just smiled and watched through the window.
Ouch. Hey, stop just watching and help us.
At some point, Holly ended up straddling Melanie. Holly kept poking Melanie's forehead. Ken, not wanting to get involved, stood at a distance, trembling. Melanie, weren't you a career woman? If you're so great at your job, surely you can think of a way to solve this problem.
What the?
Or are you just as inefficient as me? I said with a sly smile. watching Melanie's face twist in despair as she screamed.
I'm sorry.
Understandably so, as there were gardening tools nearby. Anything could happen. But even if something did, it would be an accident. It's not my fault. I'm sure someone as capable as you can handle it, I said, closing the curtains. I thought about calling an ambulance if necessary, but I watched as Melanie yelled at Ken to help stop Holly's rampage. Realizing they had no other option, Ken and Melanie managed to get Holly into a taxi and went back to their own home. A while later, Ken and I got divorced. Ken was blamed for not protecting Melanie from Holly that day, and their relationship soured. Melanie even ordered Ken to take care of Holly if he wanted to live with her. In the end, neither wanted to take responsibility, so Ken ended up paying to place Holly in a care facility. Ken's burden increased further as Melanie told him, "You're a man, so you should pay," which only exacerbated their estrangement. Now, the two are completely cut off from each other. As for me, Ken still sends messages expressing regret and pleading for reconciliation, saying, "I was out of my mind back then." He wants to live with our daughter, but I have no intention of accepting that. I've made it clear that our relationship is limited to child support. That incident revealed Ken's indecisive nature and how easily he could be influenced to act domineering. I want nothing to do with such a person. No matter what happens, I have no intention of going back to the way things were. Indeed, being a divorced housewife was challenging at first, but with the help of my parents, I managed. I've even resumed my work as a hairstylist. As long as I have my skills, I won't have trouble making a living. I can live strong and resilient without relying on Ken. Besides, my daughter and I have a new addition to our family, leaving no room for Ken. Did I get a new husband? You guessed it. He's got pointy ears, whiskers, and goes meow. Isn't he adorable? It seems he cheated on me with the neighbor's female cat, and now we're expecting kittens. They're not mine, but they're yours, so I'll take responsibility and raise them. Just kidding. My daughter, I, and our beloved cat, Mr. Bigglesworth, along with his kittens, will continue to weave lively and joyful days together. Now, I need to give the kitties their homemade treats. Time to boil some chicken.